In a marriage of nearly 2 decades, Claire has built a stable life with her husband, Daniel, but over the years, routine has dulled something inside her. When she meets David, one of Daniel's colleagues, an unexpected connection begins to form, built on lingering glances, conversations that awaken something long buried, and a closeness that is never named but is felt in every heartbeat. Caught between the comfort of the familiar and the pull of something more, Claire will be forced to confront her desires, her guilt, and the truth about what it really means to love and to choose. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Claire sat at the dining table, the low hum of the dishwasher filling the silence that had settled between her and Daniel. Across from her, he scrolled through his phone, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face. "Did you see that email from the school?" she asked, swirling the last sip of her wine in her glass. Daniel barely looked up, his thumb still moving over the screen. The email. About Lily's parent-teacher conference next week. "Oh, yeah. Just let me know when we need to be there," he said, distracted, his eyes still fixed downward. Claire sighed, not surprised. It was how most of their conversations went these days, short exchanges, logistical check-ins, the rhythm of their marriage reduced to calendar reminders and shared to-do lists. They had been married for 19 years. They were comfortable, secure, predictable. Daniel was a good man, a good father. He was responsible and kind, but somewhere along the way, they had stopped really seeing each other. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but now the silence between them felt like a third presence in the room, something unspoken but always there. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, listening to his steady breathing, she thought about the last time she had felt truly wanted. Not just appreciated, not just needed as a wife or a mother, but seen. Desired. The thought unsettled her, though she wasn't sure why. It wasn't until the following evening, at Daniel's office holiday party, that she understood. The venue was an upscale hotel ballroom, draped in warm lighting, the scent of spiced wine and pine lingering in the air. Daniel's firm hosted this event every year, but Claire never particularly looked forward to it. She had long since mastered the art of polite conversation, smiling at wives she barely knew, feigning interest in talk of business deals and market trends. She stood by the bar, holding a glass of champagne, when she felt someone step beside her. "You look like you need something stronger than that," a voice said. She turned and found herself looking into warm brown eyes, familiar yet unexpected. "David," she said, recognizing him immediately. David Hale was one of Daniel's colleagues older than her husband by a few years, sharp-witted, confident. She had met him at previous office gatherings, but had never spoken to him beyond a passing greeting. Yet now, standing so close to him, she felt something stir. "Champagne's fine," she said, lifting her glass slightly. He smirked. "If you say so." There was something in his gaze, something knowing, something curious. Claire felt an unfamiliar heat rise to her skin. "Not enjoying the party?" he asked, watching her carefully. She exhaled, glancing around the room. "It's the same every year. But Daniel likes these things. And you?" She hesitated. It was an innocuous question, yet she felt exposed. "I come. I smile. I make conversation." David tilted his head slightly. "That doesn't answer my question." She met his eyes then, feeling a subtle shift in the air between them. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting. "Do you enjoy these events?" He shrugged, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I enjoy good company." There was something unspoken in the way he said it, something just beneath the surface. Claire felt the pull of it, the quiet acknowledgement of a connection that neither of them had named yet. Before she could respond, Daniel appeared at her side, his hand resting lightly on her waist. "There you are," he said, smiling. "I was just telling Richard about Lily's soccer game last weekend. You should have seen her. David, she scored 2 goals. David shifted his gaze to Daniel, his expression easy. "Sounds like she takes after Claire, then." Daniel chuckled, oblivious to the way Claire's fingers tightened around her glass. As the conversation moved on, Claire felt herself retreat, the moment passing like a wave receding from the shore. But later that night, as she lay beside Daniel in bed, staring at the ceiling, she felt something linger. Something that hadn't been there before. something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Claire moved through the house the next morning in a haze, the remnants of last night's conversation with David clinging to her like the scent of expensive cologne. She had barely spoken to him, just a few words exchanged at the bar, a moment that shouldn't have meant anything. And yet, she couldn't stop replaying it. She stood at the kitchen counter, stirring sugar into her coffee, when Daniel walked in, adjusting his tie. "Morning," he said, pressing a quick kiss to her temple before reaching for his own mug. "Morning," she murmured, watching him as he checked his phone, his brow furrowing at something on the screen. "Busy day?" she asked. "Yeah, meetings all afternoon. And dinner with a client. Late night, then?" "Probably." He glanced up briefly, offering a small smile. "You'll be okay?" She nodded. "Of course." And just like that, he was gone. Claire exhaled, gripping her mug a little tighter. She knew this routine well, the predictable rhythm of their life. Daniel worked late. She took care of everything at home. They existed in parallel, like two train tracks running in the same direction but never quite touching. The door shut behind him, leaving the house silent except for the ticking of the clock. She took a sip of her coffee and, without meaning to, thought of David. That afternoon, Claire found herself standing in front of the mirror, smoothing down the soft fabric of her blouse before heading out. She had no real reason to be at Daniel's office. She had simply convinced herself that she needed to drop off something his forgotten planner, an excuse so thin it was almost laughable. But still, she was going. The office was sleek and modern, the scent of coffee and paper lingering in the air. She knew her way around, having visited Daniel for work functions over the years. As she walked toward his office, she passed a glass-walled conference room. And there he was, David. He was seated at the table, speaking to someone, but as if sensing her presence, he glanced up. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Claire felt the familiar heat from last night, the unspoken weight of something new pressing into the space between them. David's gaze was steady, unreadable, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his expression. She quickly looked away, her heart hammering in her chest as she walked past. By the time she reached Daniel's office, she felt foolish. This was ridiculous. She was acting like a schoolgirl with a crush, lingering in places she had no business being, imagining significance where there was none. Daniel looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Claire!" She held up his planner. "You forgot this." He smiled, walking over to take it. "Thanks. But you could have just sent me a picture of whatever I needed." "I know. I was out anyway," she lied. "Well, I'm glad you stopped by." He leaned in, kissing her cheek before pulling back. "You look nice today." She felt a strange pang at that. He meant it. She knew, but there was no weight behind it, no real noticing. Just then, from the corner of her eye, she saw David walking down the hall. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't acknowledging her at all, but somehow that made it worse. As if what had passed between them was too fragile to exist in the daylight. Claire smiled at Daniel, stepping back. "I should get going." "All right. I'll see you tonight, well, late tonight." She nodded, turning to leave, and as she walked away, she wondered if David would look back. She didn't dare check. Claire tried to shake the feeling that had settled in her chest like an unresolved chord. It was just a glance, just a moment, she told herself. Nothing had actually happened. And yet, everything felt different. That evening, she sat alone at the dining table, pushing her fork through her salad. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Lily moved around upstairs. Daniel had sent a quick text earlier. "Running late. Don't wait up." She wasn't surprised. She had long since stopped expecting anything different. Still, something about tonight felt heavier than usual. Maybe because she knew she wasn't just feeling lonely, she was noticing it. With a sigh, she picked up her phone, scrolling absently through emails until her thumb froze over an unexpected name. David Hale. It was just an email thread from the office party, one that Daniel had forwarded to her a few days ago. Nothing personal, nothing meaningful. And yet, she stared at his name longer than she should have. A few seconds later, she did something reckless. She typed his name into the search bar on social media. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through his profile. He didn't post often, just a few photos from business trips, the occasional article shared. But then she saw it. A picture from last year's office retreat. David stood near the edge of a dock, holding a glass of bourbon, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the sunset painting the water behind him. He looked relaxed, effortless. And he was looking at the camera, the way he had looked at her last night, like he saw something no one else did. Claire quickly locked her phone and placed it face down on the table, exhaling sharply. What was she doing? The next afternoon, Claire was running errands when she found herself near Daniel's office again. She wasn't sure what had drawn her there: habit, curiosity, or something far more dangerous. But as she parked near a coffee shop close to the building, she realized she had made a mistake. Because David was there, standing outside, leaning against a railing, a coffee cup in one hand, his phone in the other. And then, as if he could sense her, he looked up. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled, charged with something unspoken. Claire could have looked away. She could have turned around, pretended she hadn't seen him. But she didn't. She stepped forward. "Twice in 1 week," David murmured as she approached, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "People will start to talk." Claire rolled her eyes, trying to steady her breath. "I was just running errands," he finished for her. His gaze flickered with amusement. "Of course." She shook her head, laughing softly despite herself. "You're insufferable. I've been told." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim. "So, did you actually need to be in this part of town, or was it just a coincidence?" She hesitated, feeling the weight of his question. "Does it matter?" she asked. David's smile didn't fade, but his eyes darkened slightly, something unreadable passing through them. "Not really." The space between them felt small, too small. Claire knew she should say something else, something to break the moment before it became something neither of them could take back. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, exhaled, and pushed a hand through his hair. "I should go." She nodded, stepping back. "Of course." He lingered for half a second longer, then turned and walked away. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She told herself it was nothing, just another fleeting moment. But as she got into her car, she knew she was lying. Claire spent the rest of the day pretending that nothing had changed. She folded laundry, answered emails, and picked up Lily from school, going through the motions of a life that suddenly felt like a script she was reciting from memory. But beneath the surface, something pulsed, a quiet, persistent awareness. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet she felt guilty. That evening, Daniel was home for dinner, a rare occurrence these days. He sat across from her and Lily, listening to their daughter talk animatedly about her day, nodding along while occasionally glancing at his phone. Claire watched him, searching his face for something, anything that might anchor her back to the certainty she used to feel. After dinner, while Lily did her homework upstairs, Claire stood at the sink, washing dishes. She heard Daniel enter the kitchen, felt him step behind her. "Thanks for dinner," he said, his voice warm but distant. She nodded, focusing on the soapy water, the feel of a sponge against ceramic. A beat of silence passed. Then he touched her waist, a light, absent-minded touch, like a gesture performed out of habit rather than intent. She stiffened, not because she didn't want him to touch her, but because for the first time in a long time, she noticed it. And more than that, she noticed how different it felt from the way she imagined David's touch might feel. A sharp wave of shame crashed over her. She turned off the faucet and forced a smile as she dried her hands. "Long day?" she asked, hoping the shift in conversation would erase the thought lingering in her mind. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, just a lot going on at the firm. We're wrapping up a big deal, so everyone's on edge." She nodded, but she was barely listening. She should tell him. Not about David, there was nothing to tell, but about this quiet distance that had settled between them, the thing neither of them wanted to name. She should tell him that sometimes, when he touched her, she felt nothing at all. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned up and pressed a kiss to his cheek, a soft reassurance that neither of them questioned. And later that night, as she lay awake while Daniel slept beside her, she thought about how terrifyingly easy it was to pretend. The next morning, Claire tried to reset. She took Lily to school, went for a long walk, and made a list of things to do, mundane, ordinary things that would keep her grounded. But then, sometime in the afternoon, Her phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. Did you run into me on accident, or did you know I'd be there? Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, her pulse hammering. A moment later, another message appeared. David Hale, should I take your silence as an answer? Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could ignore it. She should ignore it. Instead, she typed 3 words. Does it matter? A long pause. Then his reply. Not really. She swallowed hard, staring at the message, the weight of it pressing into her ribs. She knew she was standing at the edge of something dangerous. She also knew that part of her, maybe a very small, very reckless part, wanted to take another step forward. And that terrified her. Claire told herself that she wouldn't respond to David again. His message had been a momentary slip, an impulse she should have ignored. But she hadn't. And now, every time she picked up her phone, her eyes flicked to his name. Days passed. She tried to pour herself into routine grocery lists, carpool schedules, dinner plans. She was a wife, a mother, a woman with responsibilities, with a life she had built carefully over the past 19 years. But something inside her felt off balance, as if a door she hadn't even realized was closed had been nudged open, just enough to let in the cold air of something unfamiliar. And then on Friday afternoon, the door opened a little wider. Claire had stopped by a cafe after running errands, nursing a latte as she watched people pass by the window. The cafe was small and quiet, the kind of place she used to frequent before life became a blur of responsibilities. She was halfway through her drink when a shadow fell over her table. Is this seat taken? The voice sent a jolt through her. She looked up, heart skipping a beat. David. For a moment, she considered lying, saying she was waiting for someone, making up an excuse. Instead, she exhaled and gestured to the empty chair. It is now. He smirked, setting down his coffee before taking the seat across from her. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, stirring his drink. Neither did I, she admitted, watching the way his fingers moved. David leaned back in his chair, studying her. You didn't answer my question the other day. Claire raised an eyebrow. Which question? He tilted his head slightly. Did you know I'd be at the office when you stopped by? She hesitated. Lying would be easy. But something about the way he looked at her made her want to tell the truth. Maybe, she admitted softly. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding. Curiosity. Something else she couldn't name. Interesting, he murmured, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Claire felt a dangerous kind of thrill at his response, the kind that left a lingering heat in her stomach. This is ridiculous, she said, shaking her head. We're talking like what? Like there's something happening here. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a thumb along the rim of his cup, his expression unreadable. Isn't there? He finally asked. The question settled between them like a challenge. Claire should have shut it down. She should have laughed it off, changed the subject, made it clear that whatever this was, it wasn't anything at all. But she didn't. Instead, she held his gaze for a second too long. A second that felt like a step forward. That night, as she lay in bed next to Daniel, his back turned to her as he slept, Claire stared at the ceiling. She had always believed that betrayal was a definitive act, a moment when a line was crossed, a choice was made. But now she realized that sometimes betrayal was quieter. Sometimes it was a door left ajar, and she had just taken another step through it. Claire woke before dawn, tangled in sheets that felt heavier than usual. The house was still, except for the occasional creak of wood settling. Beside her, Daniel slept soundly, his breathing deep and even. She turned onto her side, watching him in the dim morning light. 4 years, she had taken comfort in his presence, the solidness of him, the quiet predictability of his love. She knew Daniel loved her, even if he sometimes seemed too distracted to show it. But love wasn't the problem. The problem was the distance that had grown between them, so slowly that she hadn't noticed it until now, until David had made her notice. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. This needs to stop. She needed to stop thinking about David, stop analyzing every glance, every word. It was nothing, a passing moment of excitement in an otherwise steady life. That was what she told herself as she pulled back the covers and stepped out of bed. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. Later that morning, as Claire walked through the grocery store aisles, Her phone buzzed in her bag. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Still, she hesitated before pulling it out. David Hale, thinking about our conversation yesterday. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around the card handle. Another message appeared. Are you? Claire stared at the words, her pulse thrumming in her ears. There was no right answer. Ignoring him would be the smart choice, the responsible one. But ignoring him wouldn't erase the ache in her chest, the quiet hunger for something she wasn't ready to name.